I told you, Brian. I told you that beam would fail.
Dawn broke over a construction site in ruins. Dust still hung in the air, but one beam, and only one, stood untouched. Architect Brian Cole stared up at it, his hand clamped over his mouth, too horrified to form a single word.
You didn't listen to me. Now look at what's left of your building.
This isn't my fault. The storm was unprecedented. Nobody could have—
I told you the load calculations were wrong. I showed you the stress numbers.
He was right. I dismissed him as just labor, and I walked away.
Frank, you actually reinforced your beam. Went behind the architect's back. That's the only reason this section didn't come down.
But the truth of this morning started 3 weeks earlier, when a carpenter named Frank Morrison stepped onto the scaffolding and saw a fatal flaw that the celebrated architect, Brian Cole, had arrogantly overlooked. 3 weeks. That was all the time it took for an architect's arrogance to bring a building down, and for a carpenter's secret to stand tall against the storm. 3 weeks before the collapse, the West Avenue site hummed with progress. Steel beams rose under a clear autumn sky. Architect Brian Cole arrived, tablet in hand, surveying his creation with a practiced, self-assured stride.
This beam connection, it's too light. If a big storm rolls in, the whole span could buckle. Mr. Cole, I've been looking at the beam connection on grid 4. The specs don't account for any serious weather. I've seen the weather reports. If a nor'easter hits, this beam will fail. We need to reinforce it.
Stick to your framing, Frank. I don't need a carpenter telling me how to engineer.
Arrogance. I've seen it tear down buildings before. I won't let it happen here.
Brian dismissed him and walked away, leaving Frank standing in the dust, his warning ignored. That evening, after the crew left, Frank welded heavy steel plates onto his beam. Alone, under the fading light, he made sure it would hold. Foreman Marty watched from the ground. He'd seen Brian dismiss good men before. He chose silence. When Frank got home that evening, the apartment was quiet. But his bookshelf told a different story. Engineering texts, load calculation manuals, a diploma turned to face the wall.
I ran these numbers 3 times. The beam's capacity is 40% short of what a nor'easter would demand. That man in the suit knew how to stop this, but that man is gone.
The tools paid the bills, but they didn't quiet the mind that still saw every flaw in every structure he touched.
The reinforcement will hold, but the rest of the structure. Brian's design is a death trap. That sky is turning black. The storm is coming faster than they forecast.
He laid out his work clothes for the morning, boots ready, like a soldier preparing for a battle he knew was inevitable. That night he slept in fits, the wrench still in his hand as the wind outside began to howl.
The weatherman called it a once-in-a-decade storm. Frank knew the building wouldn't survive a once-in-a-decade wind.
He stepped out into the dark morning, the first cold drops of rain hitting his face, and headed back to the site. He had to see it for himself. When Frank pulled into the site, the sky was already a bruise. Workers were scrambling, securing tarps under the first heavy gusts.
The reinforcement would hold, but the other span. I gave Brian the numbers. He chose ignorance.
Frank, the whole site is evacuating. Get in your truck and go, now.
He obeyed, but every step away from the structure felt like leaving a patient on the operating table. Meanwhile, Brian was in his climate-controlled office, refining the rooftop garden design, completely oblivious to the storm bearing down on his creation. His phone buzzed with a severe weather alert. He swiped it away without reading it, muttering about interruptions. By nightfall, the construction site was a ghost in the wind. Rain lashed the steel and the wind screamed through the unfinished floors.
Somewhere in the dark, my beam is holding, but the rest, Brian never listened.
On his table, the numbers didn't lie. 40% overload. The math he'd tried to show Brian was still right there, circled in red. And across the city, the lights flickered as the storm battered the skyline, the true test already underway. At 3 in the morning, the storm peaked. The unreinforced beam groaned, metal twisting under a 40% overload it was never designed to bear. But Frank's beam held. The extra steel plates, the welds he'd laid in secret, they took the full force of a once-in-a-decade wind and didn't flinch. Dawn revealed the truth. Shattered concrete, twisted steel, and in the middle, one beam standing like a monument.
There it is, my beam. The only thing that didn't come down. Brian, you arrogant fool.
He stepped out of his truck and walked toward it, his boots crunching on broken glass and debris.
Frank, your beam. It's the only thing left standing. How in the hell?
Security footage captured it all. The unreinforced span failing at 3:17 a.m., while Frank's beam held rigid, refusing to buckle. Brian Cole received the call at sunrise. He sat up in bed, his hand shaking, and listened to the word collapse, as if it were in a foreign language. He raced to the site in his designer coat and stood next to Frank, staring up at the impossible.
I told you. The numbers were there. You just had to listen.
Extra plates. You welded these on without authorization. This isn't safe practice, Frank. This is sabotage.
I gave you the numbers 3 weeks ago. You called me just labor, so I labored. I made it safe.
You've destroyed my reputation. The firm will be buried in lawsuits because of your cowboy antics.
But a firefighter inspecting the beam noticed the fresh welds in the heavy plates. He called over the chief. The fire chief examined the joint and announced that the extra plates had redistributed the load. The section was over-engineered.
Over-engineered? Frank, you designed this reinforcement yourself, didn't you?
I just know how to read a structural load chart, Marty. Something our architect should have done.
He's going to bury me. The board will hear about this, and my career is finished.
The scene became a spectacle. Firefighters, inspectors, and workers all staring at the lone carpenter and his impossible beam. But Brian's panic was only the first tremor. The real earthquake was pulling into the lot in a black SUV. Marcus Shaw stepped out of the black SUV, his face as hard as the concrete slab that had fallen. He didn't need to ask what happened. He walked through the debris, workers parting like water, his eyes fixed on the standing beam.
Which of you wants to explain why half my building is on the ground, and why that one beam is still standing? I want to know everything, now.
It was a freak storm. The Weather Service said it was unprecedented. No building code could have.
Frank said nothing. He just stood there, calm, letting Brian dig his own grave.
I asked both of you. You, the carpenter, what did you do to your beam?
Before Frank could answer, Marcus called over a forensic engineer, a third-party inspector with no loyalty except to the truth.
The failure started here at the unreinforced joint. But this section, it's been modified. These plates aren't on the plans.
Marcus's eyes moved from the inspector to Frank, then back to Brian. The contradiction was already forming.
The failure started at the unreinforced joint, but this section has been modified. Extra plates, new welds, not on any drawing.
That's unauthorized modification. He could have compromised the whole structural grid.
Actually, these plates redistributed the load. Without them, this beam would have buckled as well.
How did you know exactly what to add, Morrison? A carpenter doesn't just guess structural reinforcement.
Frank opened his mouth, then closed it. The calculation was in his head, but the truth was locked behind a door he hadn't opened in 15 years. A worker sifting through debris near Frank's scaffold found a leather notebook, damp but intact. He handed it to Marcus. Marcus opened it. The pages were covered in hand-drawn load diagrams, shear force calculations, and a note in sharp pencil. If Brian won't check, I will.
This isn't a carpenter's guesswork. These equations are from a trained engineer's hand.
Brian craned his neck to see, but Marcus snapped the notebook shut, his eyes fixed on Frank with a new, heavy question. The notebook in his hand was a time bomb. Marcus held it tight, and for the first time, Frank looked less like a carpenter and more like a man hiding something crucial. Marcus gestured toward the site trailer. No more questions in the open. Inside, the fluorescent light buzzed like a countdown. He placed the notebook on the desk and opened it again, the pages full of numbers that no carpenter should have known.
These aren't guesses, Morrison. You ran a full load analysis. Where did a carpenter learn to do that? I didn't always wear a tool belt. There's a reason I know what a beam can take.
This is absurd. If you are engineered, why have you been swinging a hammer for the past decade?
Brian, be quiet. You've said enough today. Go on, Frank. I'll explain everything tomorrow. But the short version is that I ran the numbers because Brian wouldn't.
Marcus leaned back, his expression shifting from anger to a cold, calculating curiosity. This man was more valuable than he'd ever expected.
This is it. He's going to tell them everything, and I'll be finished.
Tomorrow morning, both of you. My office, Morrison. You'll lay out the full story. Brian, you'll sit and listen. Understood.
At 9 the next morning, Frank walked into the trailer and placed a small laminated card on the table.
Here is how I knew. Professional engineer. License number 6249. You held a PE for 15 years, and you've been working as a carpenter.
That's impossible. He's been a carpenter since I've known him.
Flashback to a younger Frank in a tie, staring at a set of blueprints marked in red, the weight of the decision on his face.
15 years at Apex Designs. I left because they cut corners I refused to sign off on. I'd rather build with my hands than ink a lie. When Brian dismissed me, I ran the numbers on my own time. The beam was undersized by nearly half.
Brian's face crumbled. The word undersized hit him like a second collapse. The notebook lay open to the note Frank had penciled weeks ago. If Brian won't check, I will. In that trailer, the truth stood as stark as the beam outside. One man had known all along, and the other had refused to listen.
If he was an engineer, he should have gone through proper channels. He shouldn't have taken it on himself.
Proper channels? You dismissed his warning like he was asking for a coffee break. I showed you the numbers, Brian. You called me labor. You'd already decided I had nothing worth hearing. You had a licensed engineer on your crew, and you didn't listen. The only reason we're not looking at a body count is because Frank acted anyway. Frank's reinforcement was off the books, but it held when your design failed. We'll be revisiting every calculation you've ever signed.
Brian collapsed into his chair like the air had been sucked out of him. Everything he'd built was crumbling alongside the concrete.
Frank, your actions were unorthodox, but they saved lives. The board will decide how to proceed, but for now, you have my respect. I just did what the numbers told me. Whatever comes next, I am ready. I'll call an emergency board meeting tomorrow. Until then, both of you are suspended. Don't leave town.
Frank and Brian walked out into the cold morning, heading in opposite directions, one certain of his integrity, the other certain of nothing. Marcus called Frank back into the trailer before he could reach his truck. The door clicked shut on the cold morning.
Frank, I want you to consult on the rebuild. Review every plan before we pour another yard of concrete.
Frank read the terms. It was more than he'd earned in a year of swinging a hammer.
I'll do it, but I need full access to the design team and no shortcuts.
Brian watched from his car as Frank sealed a deal that should have been his. The trailer window framed the handshake like a portrait of his own failure. He slammed the door and gripped the wheel until his knuckles turned white. The board would hear about this. Frank stepped out in time to see Brian's car disappear around the corner. No words had been exchanged. None were needed. Inside, Marcus was already on the phone, his voice low but decisive. I am bringing Morrison on as lead consultant. Brian Cole is suspended pending full review.
The steel was cold under his hand, but it felt like an old friend that had kept its promise.
The sun set over the broken site, but for the first time, Frank saw not just the ruin, but the rebuild, and himself at the center of it. By the following week, the site had been cleared, new materials stacked like fresh lumber, and Frank Morrison stood at the center, blueprints in hand.
We check every weld, every bolt, like our names are on the line, because they are.
His hard hat still read Carpenter, but the crew had already started calling him boss. Marcus watched from the perimeter. He didn't say a word, but the nod was enough. Across town, Brian sat in a dark living room, the only light coming from his laptop. A news article about the collapse filled the screen.
They keep showing that photo, my failure, framed in pixels for the whole city to see.
He slammed the screen shut and pressed his fists into his eyes. The silence was heavier than the concrete. Back on site, a young ironworker handed Frank a steel plate, and Frank gave a curt nod of approval. Respect was earned in inches.
The numbers on this page meant he'd sleep tonight. The last page had cost him weeks of sleepless nights.
When the crew packed up, Frank stayed behind. He walked the beams with a flashlight, checking every connection himself. Old habits and new responsibility. Brian sat in Marcus's office, the leather chair no longer a throne but a witness stand.
The board gave you one more chance. You'll report to Frank Morrison. Every plan, every decision goes through him.
Reporting to the man I called just labor. I've handed him the reins.
He signed the agreement without reading it. The pen scratched like a sentence. Out in the corridor, he felt the weight of it. An architect now second to a carpenter.
Brian's back on probation. He's under you. Don't let him undermine the rebuild.
When Brian's car pulled in, the crew fell silent. Frank walked to the gate, arms crossed.
Brian, your desk is in the trailer. I'll brief you on the new load specs.
A handshake and a briefing, like I am a new hire.
Frank turned toward the site, and Brian followed. The crew watched the two men walk into the steel skeleton, the new order settling like dust.
Tighten that bolt before the next lift.
The ironworker didn't move. His eyes went to Frank, and the tool stayed still until Frank gave a nearly invisible shake of his head.
We torque after the lift. The new sequence is posted in the trailer. Follow it.
Brian's jaw tightened. He'd been overruled in front of a crew that used to nod at his every word.
Even the nuts and bolts answer to him now.
We're reinforcing the load path here by 30%. Every weld gets a double check. That's not negotiable.
The crew leaned in, arms uncrossed, questions ready. At the back, Brian stood rigid watching the room orbit a new sun. Marcus, on the walkway, nodded once. Frank unscrewed his thermos as the last man left. The steam caught the low light.
Coffee. It's strong and bitter, but it's hot.
Brian took the cup. The first sip was a long time coming. They sat on a beam together, two men and a thermos, the silence no longer a weapon.
The steel supplier had a fire. The 14-inch plates won't be here for 3 weeks. We need a workaround now.
We'll switch to a cantilevered anchor, but it'll require re-engineering 3 adjacent joints.
Or we weld a pair of 10-inch plates with a shear connector. Same load transfer, no cascading redesign.
Brian stared at the sketch, tracing the lines with his finger. For a long moment, he said nothing.
That would work.
Marcus tapped the paper and nodded. The decision left no room for argument. By noon, Brian's hands were greased, a wrench in his grip, bolts turning under his own force for the first time.
Tighten it until the plate bites. Then another quarter turn. You'll feel it seat.
Funny how a wrench shakes off more rust than a desk ever could.
They worked shoulder to shoulder. The crew noticed, and for the first time, so did Brian. So did Brian. The last beam rose against the evening sky. The gantry fell silent. The rebuild was almost complete.
Final inspection is at 7 a.m. The board will make their decision by noon. Everything hinges on tomorrow.
Brian pulled Frank aside. His voice was low.
If the board finds out I am the reason that beam failed, they'll never trust a design I touch again.
Then show them you are not that man anymore. When the inspector points, pick up the wrench and fix it.
Dawn broke cold. The inspector's flashlight caught a weld that wasn't fully fused. A joint Brian's team had worked the week before.
This won't pass. You've got 2 hours before the board arrives.
My guys did that joint. I'll fix it. Give me a torch and a fresh rod.
For the next hour, Brian's hands moved with a precision born of desperation. Frank watched, then picked up a mask and joined him. 2 arcs lit the dark. At 7 sharp, the inspector returned. Marcus stood with the board members on the walkway. The fate of 2 men hung on a single joint, still warm. The inspector ran his thumb along the repaired weld, then clicked off his flashlight.
The joint is sound. Now show me the beam that held when the rest came down. This reinforcement saved lives. The site passes final inspection.
Frank Morrison, based on the inspector's report and your history, the board has made you site lead.
Marcus shook Frank's hand firmly. The crew erupted. Cheers, whistles, hard hats tossed in the air.
I owe you a public apology, Frank. I dismissed your warning, and I was wrong. You saved this project.
The crew applauded. Frank gave a small, quiet smile, and Brian placed a hand on his shoulder. The inspector handed the past certificate to Marcus, who raised it high. The morning sun caught the beam behind them.
The steel said it for me. I told you, Brian.
They gathered for a photo, the beam rising behind them, now a monument to the day a carpenter's words became a building's backbone.
Before we break, there's one last thing. This hard hat's been waiting for its owner.
Marcus took the new helmet and placed it on Frank's head. It fit like it had always been his. Frank took off the old one. Scratched, dented, the word Carpenter faded on the rim and held it a moment. The crew roared. Marty clapped Frank's back so hard the new hard hat wobbled.
You were right from the start, Frank. I should have listened. I am sorry.
Water under the bridge, Brian. We've got more buildings to keep standing.
They shook hands, and the crew's applause echoed through the new steel frame. A bronze plaque was bolted onto the standing beam. It read, "Integrity tested. This beam stood when others fell." Frank touched the letters, his fingertips tracing the word integrity, as if it were the only thing that had ever mattered. The building stood complete, its flag snapping in the wind, and the beam at its core a silent testimony to the man who'd refused to let it fall. Later that evening, after the crew had gone home, Marcus and Frank walked the silent site. The new building rose around them like a promise kept.
The board approved a new policy. Every architect in this firm will now spend a full week on the ground with the crew before they finalize any design. That'll save more than concrete, Marcus. It'll save reputations and lives.
Brian stepped out from behind a pillar, his designer coat replaced by a work jacket. He'd been listening.
I've been designing from a desk too long. If you'll have me, I'd like to keep learning from the men who actually build.
It's never too late to learn, Brian. The steel doesn't care about your degree. It only cares if you respect it.
The three men walked together through the atrium, the beam's plaque catching the last light of day. From above, the crew was tiny, but their work stood tall, a monument to the quiet truth that building lasts when listening comes first. Marcus handed Frank's worn notebook to a young architect. "Read it," he said. "It's the difference between a drawing and a building." Frank's hands, clean now, rested on a fresh set of blueprints. The numbers were right. They always had been. Weeks later, Frank returned to the building alone. The lobby lights were low and the atrium echoed with a silence that felt like respect. He stood before the beam, hands in his pockets. The plaque caught the dim light, and the steel seemed to hum with the memory of the storm. Below the first plaque, a second one had been added. Warning heeded, from the crew who builds.
3 words. That's all it takes to build a bridge or burn one. I'm glad I chose the right ones.
He reached out and pressed his palm flat against the beam. The steel was cold, but the gesture was warm with vindication. He walked away, his silhouette shrinking against the lit atrium. A tool belt in his truck, the only thing that still called him Carpenter. The old tool belt lay on the passenger seat, the leather worn but unbroken, like the man who'd worn it. He drove away, the building shrinking in his rearview mirror, its lights warm against the evening sky. The beam stood tall even in the glass, and from a distance, the beam caught the last light like a great bronze arrow, pointing silently upward, a permanent echo of the carpenter's warning. Frank smiled at his reflection in the window, and the city lights blurred past. Some words don't need to be shouted, they just need to stand. The change started on a new site, where a classroom sat where the foundation used to be. Young architects stood with tool belts, learning from the ground up. Frank led the workshop, pointing at a beam mock-up, his words simple and sure: "Understand the steel, and you'll never build a failure." Brian sat in the front row, flannel sleeves rolled up, a notepad on his knee. The architect had become a student again. Marcus watched from the back, arms crossed, the pride of a man who had bet on character and won. A young architect handed Frank a rolled-up plan, and he received it with the same hands that had once welded a secret into steel. Frank, Brian, and Marcus walked a new site together, no longer divided by ego, but aligned by hard-won trust. In the finished building, the old beam now held a framed photo of the crew and a vase of fresh flowers. The plaque beneath it had become a quiet destination, and in the late afternoon sun, the beam's shadow stretched across the wall like a perfect arrow, pointing straight at the word integrity.
Every building is a promise. The best ones are made with more than steel. They're made with the truth of the people who build them.
And as the sun set, the beam stood as it always had, straight, silent, and strong, a permanent reminder that the truth, when it's built right, never falls.